Hey guys, in this video what we're going to do is I listed out a bunch of different kind of properties here. There's actually 6 different properties, and we're going to decide if these are rectangle, rhombuses, squares, parallelograms, or multiple of those things. So if you forgot maybe what those definitions of each of those different types of quadrilaterals are, you might want to check this video up here where I go over some of those properties, especially for rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. Otherwise, let's get right into it with this first one. It says all sides are congruent. All right, all sides are congruent. So if we think about which ones would work here, well, I know a rectangle, that wouldn't work, right? The opposite sides are congruent, but not all of them. However, in a rhombus, that is true. Okay, and remember, if something is a rhombus, then a square, since it's also a rhombus, that would be true for a square as well. All right. In fact, you're going to learn here pretty quick that a square is going to be able to fit most of these different properties. All right, let's try number 2. Number 2 says all angles are congruent. Again, the ones that have all angles are congruent, in this case, are going to be ones that have 90-degree angles. All right, the ones that don't, I think a parallelogram and a rhombus, those don't necessarily have to have all their angles being congruent, but a rectangle and a square do. All right, next one, number 3, says that the diagonals are congruent. All right, so ones that have diagonals that are congruent is a rectangle and a square. All right, rhombus has perpendicular diagonals, but they're not necessarily congruent. Okay, so that moves us to our second column over here. Number 4 says opposite angles are congruent. And again, if we think about these different ones, well, opposite angles are congruent. That's one of the definitions of a parallelogram. And since rectangles, rhombuses, and squares are all certain types of parallelograms, this one's going to be all 4 of those types up above. All right, next one, number 5, says diagonals bisect the opposite angles. Again, if we kind of think through this here, a rectangle, not necessarily true. A rhombus, though, that is part of the definition of a rhombus. And then since it's true for a rhombus, it has to also be true for a square. All right, last one says diagonals are perpendicular. So if you think about where they cross, if you connect the different corners or the opposite corners, and then where those cross, are those going to be perpendicular? I think that only happens in a rhombus and in a square. Not necessarily in a parallelogram or rectangle, but definitely these two. All right, guys, if you found this video helpful, you might also find this video helpful where we go through and solve for some different values in rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. Why don't you check that one out, and we'll see you in the next one.